This organization did not ignore security. They invested in it. They hired specialists. They bought modern tools. They implemented controls. They followed best practices. They passed audits. From the outside, it looked exactly like the kind of organization that should not get breached. From the inside, security felt mature, structured, reasonable, and still, someone got in. Not by smashing through defenses, not by exploiting something obviously broken, but by using the system exactly as it was designed to be used. That is what makes these incidents so difficult to explain, and why they keep happening. When an organization says it's secure, what does that actually mean? It usually doesn't mean invulnerable. It means organized. It means security exists as a framework. Firewalls are in place. Endpoint protection is deployed. Identity systems manage access. Logging is centralized. Incident response plans exist. Sometimes there are certifications, sometimes regulatory approvals, sometimes external audits. Security is visible, documented, measurable, and often genuinely well implemented. There are no obvious gaps, no abandoned systems, no missing basics, which is exactly why breaches in these environments feel unsettling, because they don't match the story we like to tell about cyber risk. That breaches only happen where security is weak, outdated, or careless. After a breach, the same question always appears. What failed? Was it a tool, a missed patch, a configuration error, a human mistake? But when you examine many real-world incidents closely, something uncomfortable becomes clear. Nothing actually failed. Authentication worked. Access controls enforced the rules they were given. Logs were generated. Alerts existed. Security did not break. Security behaved normally. And that is where the real problem begins. Because when security behaves normally, failure becomes difficult to see. To understand this, we need to talk about trust. Specifically, how trust becomes embedded into systems. Consider the SolarWinds incident. SolarWinds was not a small, unknown vendor. Its software was used by governments, critical infrastructure providers, and major enterprises all over the world. Organizations trusted it. They had to. Supply chains depend on trust. Manual inspection does not scale. Automation exists because humans cannot verify everything themselves. Updates were digitally signed. Distribution channels were legitimate. Installation processes were routine. From the organization's perspective, everything looked correct. No exploit was required inside the customer environment. No firewall was bypassed. No endpoint protection was defeated. The compromise happened upstream, inside a trusted supply chain. Once the update was installed, the system behaved exactly as designed. It ran approved code. It communicated in expected ways. It used legitimate processes. No alarm fired, because nothing unexpected occurred. The breach did not crash through security controls. It moved through trust. And for months, the compromise remained invisible. This is the part many organizations struggle to accept. SolarWinds did not succeed because defenders were incompetent. They succeeded because defenders were rational. Organizations rely on vendors because they must. They rely on automation because manual verification is impossible at scale. They rely on trust because without it, nothing functions. Security teams did not fail to deploy controls. They failed to question assumptions that had never been challenged before. That is not negligence. That is a failure mode. Every mature organization operates on assumptions. That approved software is safe. That internal systems are lower risk than external ones. That documented access is justified. That compliance implies protection. These assumptions are not reckless. They are practical. They allow complex systems to function. But over time, they accumulate. And as they accumulate, exposure grows quietly. Not in obvious places, not at the perimeter, not where attention is focused, but in inherited trust, in legacy access, in decisions that were once reasonable and never revisited. Now consider Equifax. This breach did not involve an advanced zero-day vulnerability. The issue was known, a patch existed, the risk was understood, and still, nothing changed. Why? Because in large organizations, knowing about risk does not mean it gets fixed. Patching competes with uptime. Ownership is unclear. Responsibility is distributed across teams. Risk acceptance becomes implicit. No single decision caused the breach. A series of reasonable delays did. Each delay made sense on its own. Each decision was defensible in isolation. Together, they created exposure. And by the time the vulnerability mattered, it was already too late. Equifax did not fail because it lacked vulnerability management. It failed because process never turned into action. Security teams identified the risk. The risk was documented. The risk was discussed. But remediation depended on priorities outside security. And when those priorities did not align, exposure remained. Quietly. At this point, people usually ask another question. Why didn't monitoring catch it? Because monitoring detects signals. One, you were none. He knock in on. Not meaning. Logs record activity. Alerts trigger on patterns. But when exploitation looks like normal behavior, detection is slow, especially when teams are conditioned to expect noise rather than consequence. Monitoring did not fail. It was never designed to compensate for delayed decisions. Now consider a more recent example. Capita, a large services provider, a highly complex environment, heavy reliance on outsourcing and third-party services. In this case, attackers did not need sophisticated techniques. They did not need 0 days. They did not need advanced malware. They did not need to bypass modern security tools. They used access that already existed: service accounts, broad permissions, limited oversight. These accounts had been created for operational convenience. They were meant to keep systems running smoothly, to avoid delays, to reduce friction, to make integration easier. And once created, they were rarely revisited, not because anyone forgot about security, but because ownership was unclear. Risks had been documented, assessments had been performed, warnings had been raised, concerns had been logged, but documentation did not equal remediation. Fixing these issues required coordination between security, between IT, between vendors, between business units. And when responsibility is shared, urgency fades. By the time the breach occurred, the access paths were already open, not because security controls were missing, but because no one owned the full risk end-to-end. SolarWinds, Equifax, Capita, different industries, different attackers, different outcomes, the same underlying pattern. Controls existed, risks were known, systems behaved exactly as designed. The breach happened in the space between responsibility and reality, between what was documented and what was actually understood. This is where many security programs quietly struggle. Security is often treated as a layer, a collection of tools, a set of policies, a compliance requirement. But security is not static. Complex systems drift. Access expands gradually. Trust accumulates over time. Temporary exceptions become permanent. Legacy decisions persist long after their context is gone. The environment changes faster than the documentation, and slowly the system you think you are protecting no longer exists. This drift is rarely visible all at once. It happens incrementally. One exception here, one integration there, one account created for convenience, one system kept online because it's still needed. Each decision makes sense on its own. Together they create exposure. And because nothing appears broken, nothing triggers urgency. This is why security incidents in mature organizations are often detected late, not because alerts are missing, But because alerts are not connected to understanding, logs exist, dashboards exist, metrics exist, but visibility is fragmented. Each team sees its own slice of the environment. Security sees controls. ET sees uptime. Compliance sees documentation. The business sees delivery. No single team sees how everything interacts under real pressure. When something finally goes wrong, the investigation begins, and the same realization appears again and again. Everyone did their job. Security deployed tools. IT maintained systems. Compliance ensured policies existed. Vendors delivered services. But no one owned the whole system. That ownership gap is another failure mode. Modern organizations unintentionally make this problem worse. They move fast. They integrate constantly. They automate aggressively. They rely on cloud platforms and third parties. Speed becomes a requirement, and security is expected to adapt without slowing anything down. But complexity grows faster than understanding. Each new system adds new relationships. Each new integration adds new trust assumptions. Each new automation reduces human visibility. Security tools multiply, but insight does not scale at the same pace. This is where attackers gain advantage, not because they are smarter, but because they are patient. They observe, they wait, they look for paths that already exist. They do not need to defeat controls. They only need to operate inside them. At this point, it's tempting to say the solution is more tools, more monitoring, more automation, more controls. But this thinking misses the point. Most of these organizations already had plenty of tools. What they lacked was shared understanding. They knew what controls existed. They did not fully understand how those controls interacted. They knew where access was documented. They did not always know where access was actually meaningful. This is why post-incident reviews often feel unsatisfying. They focus on what happened, which account was used, which system was accessed, which control could have helped. But they struggle to explain why the organization was exposed in the first place, because the answer is rarely a single mistake. It is usually systemic. Security failures at this level are rarely dramatic. They are quiet. They emerge slowly. They exploit normal behavior. They hide behind legitimacy. And by the time the breach becomes visible, the damage has already been done. This is the uncomfortable reality. Secure organizations don't fail because they ignore security. They fail because complexity outpaces understanding. They fail because responsibility is fragmented. They fail because trust accumulates silently. They fail because no one has a complete map of how the system truly behaves. And once this happens, traditional defenses struggle. Firewalls still work. Identity systems still enforce rules. Monitoring still collects data, but none of these answer the deeper question. Should this behavior have been possible at all? That question is rarely asked, because asking it requires stepping outside individual roles. It requires looking at the system as a whole, and most organizations are not structured to do that consistently. This is why the same patterns repeat across industries, across regions, across maturity levels. The names change, the technologies change, the failure mode stays the same. Once you start looking at breaches through this lens, a pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The organizations that fail are not the ones without security. They are the ones where security exists everywhere, except at the system level. Each team does its part. Each control performs its function. Each process looks reasonable in isolation. But the organization never pauses to ask a harder question. What does this system actually allow someone to do? This question matters because modern environments are no longer simple. They are not a firewall, a server, and a user. They are ecosystems, cloud platforms connected to on-prem systems, vendors integrated into core workflows, automation creating and modifying access continuously, identity becoming the new perimeter. In these environments, risk does not live at the edge. It lives in relationships, between systems, between roles, between trust boundaries that no longer feel like boundaries at all. This is why attackers rarely need to be innovative. They don't need to invent new techniques. They study the environment as it already exists. They look for places where trust has accumulated without oversight. They look for access that was once temporary but became permanent. They look for systems that everyone assumes someone else is watching. And almost always they find them. At this point, many organizations respond the same way. They add controls, more monitoring, more alerts, more tools, more dashboards. But this often makes the problem worse because more tools increase complexity, and complexity without understanding is exactly what created the exposure in the first place. Security becomes louder, not clearer. This is the paradox. The more complex the environment becomes, the harder it is to understand how it behaves. And the harder it is to understand, the more organizations rely on assumptions. Assumptions about trust, assumptions about ownership, assumptions about what is out of scope. These assumptions are rarely written down. They live in habits, in culture, in the way work actually gets done, and attackers are very good at finding them. This is why post-incident questions often feel frustrating. Why did this account have access? Because it always had access. Why was this system exposed? Because it was never clearly owned. Why didn't anyone notice? Because no single signal looked abnormal. Each answer makes sense. Together, they reveal a system that no one fully understood. At a deeper level, this is not a technical problem. It is an organizational one. Modern security failures are failures of coordination, failures of visibility across teams, failures of shared responsibility, failures of asking uncomfortable questions early. They are failures of governance in the original sense of the word. Who is responsible for the system as a whole? In many organizations, the answer is unclear. Security owns controls. ET owns infrastructure. The business owns outcomes. Compliance owns documentation. Risk lives in between, and anything that lives in between tends to be ignored. This is why secure organizations still get hacked, not because they lack defenses, but because they lack a shared understanding of how those defenses interact. They know what they have. They don't always know what it enables. When security is reduced to a checklist, this gap widens. Controls are verified. Policies are approved. Audits are passed. But no one steps back to examine the behavior those controls allow when combined. Security becomes something you have, not something you understand. The organizations that avoid this failure mode do something different. They focus less on adding controls and more on removing blind spots. They treat access as temporary by default. They revisit trust relationships regularly. They challenge legacy decisions. They assume that drift is inevitable. Most importantly, they ask systemic questions. What happens if this access is abused? Who would notice? Who would stop it? And who is responsible if no one does? These questions are uncomfortable. They slow things down. They create friction. But they surface risk while it is still theoretical, not after it becomes real. Attackers exploit certainty. Certainty that a vendor is trusted. Certainty that a system is internal. Certainty that an account is legitimate. Certainty that compliance implies safety. They don't fight security head-on. They let assumptions do the work. This is why many breaches look obvious in hindsight, not because the risk was invisible, but because it was normalized. It existed for so long that it stopped feeling dangerous. Security at its core is not about preventing every breach. That is impossible. It is about understanding how failure would occur, where it would begin, how it would spread, and how quickly it would be noticed. When organizations lose sight of this, controls become theater. They look impressive. They generate metrics. They satisfy requirements. But they do not prevent failure. Secure organizations don't fail because they ignore security advice. They fail because they confuse presence with comprehension. They assume that because something is controlled, it is safe. They assume that because something is documented, it is understood. They assume that because something hasn't failed yet, it won't. But systems do not fail all at once. They fail gradually, through drift, through accumulation, through assumptions left unchallenged. And when the failure finally surfaces, it feels sudden, even though it has been forming for years. That is the failure mode behind many modern cyber incidents. Not broken defenses, not missing tools, not careless teams, but systems operating normally in ways no one questioned deeply enough until it mattered.